Today's podcast is going to be on cryptocurrency. Is it the new Wampum? Basically, referring to Wampum as old Native American form of currency. Basically, out in the Northeast, Wampum was originally used as a currency as well as decorative beads. And the wampum we're referring to is the wampum from an actual black and purple bead from the quahog clamshell, which is essentially a hard clamshell that people would use for food, as well as in this case they would use the specific areas on the shell for making both beads and beads for decoration purposes as well as currency. Now we're going to basically, now as opening up, I'm going to be asking people to think about being generous and donating to my Patreon page. It's www.patreon.com/challengehistory, and it starts at $1, goes at levels of $10, $25, $50, and $100. $50 and $100 will have a future once we reach the platforms of enough people to make it worthwhile. Is a $50 will be a silver Roman coin giveaway and a gold Byzantine coin giveaway for one lucky person. It'll start as a year with it, and it'll go up depending on the number of people who donate at each one of those levels. I might add new tiers with it if the number of people at each one of those levels start to go up to higher levels of donation, but just to suit the number of people. Now, with this topic, we need to look at the cases with it and look at on the realistic points. Now, in this case, what gives us legitimate reason to assume so is of illegal Bitcoin cryptocurrency mining. And we've seen it in South Korea, we've seen it in a bunch of different places. We've even seen in cases of people hacking into the Tesla cars themselves and using those to actually illegally mine Bitcoin. Now, I'm not just using not just using Bitcoin in itself with it, because it's not the only one, but there are a lot of ones that are supposed to be a hedge against inflation and anti-inflationary sources, and are supposed to essentially guard against it. Yet the fact is, because you're not holding an actual physical piece like gold or silver like we have, or other precious metals like we have over the history of the world, it doesn't have the validity like what other things have. And because it is a digital currency, it can be manipulated illegally, no different than any other files can, or on a computer or a network can. And this is the whole problem that we're dealing with, and the way we need to look at it essentially is no different than the digital version of what we're talking about with the automatic wampum making machines that were happening in the 1800s. And originally with it, what was happening with it was we initially were trading gold and silver, but what ended up happening was there were some designers that came up with the idea of this automatic wampum making machine, and it would basically create this. And what it did in the end is it created this whole idea that they thought it would actually create more wealth for the people they were trying to trade with it by making more of these. Well, they didn't realize that there was a whole idea of supply and demand. That's the whole point of how these things work. Thus, It was supposed to basically clean out all of the stuff, leaving just the shells behind, and uh, the problem being is what you were left with was essentially you had a lot of these wampum from it. Well, the benefit of the whole system was that what you created was this of the system before was because they had to be hand cut and hand carved and hand polished, that limited the number of wampum that could ever make it on the market. And the trade was actually valid between gold and silver for the wampum, and this made it a very, very fair trade for using as monetary value for different goods in between. Well, when they changed this, and an automatic wampum making machine by the Americans themselves came about, this was an actual problem. This essentially created a system to where they were doing the same thing as printing money just constantly, which is much different than actually having gold and silver as your currency. That's the reason why, if you look at what we have as our holder of wealth now with it, we have actually just money. We have actually just paper money, which is no better than the actual holder of wealth, which is why Bitcoin was created in the first place. It was meant to essentially offshoot it, and it was meant to give people an alternative to the actual holding of gold and using it through a digital system. Now, when we look at Bitcoin, it's suffering through the same problems as those initial things we're suffering through, and this is the whole problem, is it can keep going through these things, and even though these might be small in the events, eventually it's going to grow, and you're going to find these things happening. Now, eventually what's going to happen is this is going to infiltrate the whole idea of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is going to eventually become this whole Bitcoin, as well as the other cryptocurrency things that are meant to be a hedge against the inflation, being an anti-inflationary currency. It's eventually going to be a problem because it's going to repeat what the original problem was with the wampum. And this is why when people say, "Well, what's the best way to go against it?" There's still people like me who basically say go with physical precious metals. Gold, silver, platinum, palladium, hell, even copper copper rounds are a very good investment as well if you can't afford the other, because those are still actually a something that holds value. Because it needs to have something that actually holds on to value. And the way it does that is through actual marketing, is through an actual marketing value. Now, the problem being is these things are always going to exist. When you have a digital currency or something that can't actually have an actual concrete value. Now, when we're talking about such things as, we'll look at the idea of what we see on the elemental chart, you're going to see this. You'll probably see that on the periodical table. You'll probably see things on there. Like right there, you're going to see copper. And when you look at copper, pure copper with it, it's going to be, that's one of them. Now, when you look at palladium, it might be down here. Yeah, it's PD and okay, I know where it is now. Yeah, it's right there. Palladium's right there. You have palladium, you have copper, you have palladium, you have platinum, which is another one. Would be another one to invest in. You have gold and you have silver. These 5 right here are the ones that you're going to talk about investing to. Specifically, if you can invest in these 4. These 2 right here are the big ones to invest to. These 2 are kind of alternatives, and this is kind of like a cheaper alternative to invest into as well. And what you're going to, rhodium is used. It's very, very hard to invest into because there's nothing really physically that they use it with in an investment form. Now the benefit is you have the ability to have physical forms of these 5, which is just great. And these are some of the things that are basically great to actually have because they're used in many different applications. And this is something you want. And when we're talking about, and that means when we're talking chemically they cannot be copied, because when we're talking about a lot of other materials, we're talking when people are looking for the investments, they're not going to invest in a facsimile because facsimiles do not have the same properties, such as cubic zirconia will not have the same it has the same physical a lot of the same properties as diamond. This is a different thing when we're talking about this, is because this is a different these have different properties when we're talking about metals, and you can't just start copying them when you're talking about the chemical points. Usually you have to use something within the range. And essentially what they've done is there's basically only about 5 of them that actually have some of the properties that they want, and those are all the ones that I pretty much named. The only ones that are outside that range are rhodium and iridium. Beyond those ones, and those are all very expensive. And what needs to be understood is you cannot take anything like out here or anything like that and start matching things together to create anything like that. It will not react in the same way. It's not going to be a metal. That's going to react like like you need to, and that's the whole problem. And that's why when we're talking about what's happening with you can create a lot of compounds that are actually beneficial to humans, but they're not going to be, if you match them up properly, we're talking, they're going to be beneficial, but such as if you look at your different labels of salts, they're going to be beneficial, but they're not going to work in the same way. And that's why when we look at these things, we need to understand that. So that's why when the actual cost comes for these things with it, they're basically currently, as we're talking, we know at least when it comes to silver and gold, comparatively with what we're talking of actual legitimate numbers of their actual cost. Their cost for what people are actually paying in the industry is well above, and it's quite possibly we're talking 3 to 5 times the actual cost of what they're actually showing in the marketplace. That means that they represent a great hedge on these things, and that it means that economically we're in trouble as well. But that's obviously something I got to in my previous previous video. I believe it was earlier today, and I I believe that was earlier today. I touched upon that. And that was a live stream that I did that. But basically, when it comes down to it, is people need to understand that when we look at these, the ones that are, metals are very, very important, and they're going to be based off a single element. And you could have, obviously, like steel is going to be a mix of multiple elements, but the fact is it's not going to, it doesn't have, and obviously you have stainless steel as well, which is being more elements, but it doesn't have the actual properties that some of these other ones have for conductivity. When we're talking about about wire, that's why, and actually the connection points, that's why they use these, and that's why they're opting for them over a bunch of other metals. Otherwise, these companies would be looking to save a lot more money. They wouldn't be looking. I mean, if you're looking at, like, let's say, cell phones, they're using on the interior, they're using a great deal of silver. Now, if silver were an economic choice, they would be using it on the outside as well when they're using the actual phones. But when they're using metal, they're actually using brushed aluminum. Now, this shows that silver is actually a very costly metal, so they don't want to be using excessive amounts of it. But this shows that it is a necessary metal to make the cell phones work properly. And it shows that there is an actual value. So there is a value beyond the actual use of currency. And because we're not using it as an actual currency in the States, it actually acts as an actual hedge because it against inflation, because it actually has a value on the market. Unlike in the case of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is just a digital number and really represents nothing more and can be manipulated at any time, and especially when we have fears of the government manipulating things, especially they would be against their own interest, I don't really feel very, very safe in cryptocurrencies at all. And they could essentially be using these things to essentially flood the markets with them, especially stuff coming out of New York. They use New York as one of the locations. Now, that is the location of the major Federal Reserve Bank. Now, it would be in the best interest of the Federal Reserve Bank not to have something competing with the fiat currency. This should be a very, very key thing for people to understand that it would be in their best interest, since it's in their best interest, not to have something competing with it, as well as to use the government agencies to restrict the price of gold from going up. It would show that that they would use cryptocurrency mining technology to actually do this. They could use this through the NSA, because the NSA does have buildings through within the area that could actually do this and could mine the actual system to make sure that you're flooding it, to make sure that it is going down. Because at one point we were talking that Bitcoin was over 10,000, and its current rate, as we see up here, is about 4,000 per. And that should give you a real good idea with what they've done. I think that we're talking that they've done this deliberately to essentially impact the value, because you have that as an actual point with it. They're going to be fighting against that. Now, when it comes to physical things like gold and silver, they can't fight against that. You can't destroy matter. So no matter what they do, they couldn't do that. And if they bought up gold and silver, that would essentially automatically put us back onto a gold or silver standard, a precious metal standard, which would essentially change the way the economic system works. So they would never want to be doing that. That would essentially be going well against their interests. So they do not want to be buying up gold and silver either, which shows you that they actually have an interest against that. They just want to basically be using the economic stabilization departments to essentially reduce the price of gold and silver to make sure that they don't rise too high, because that's essentially something to help the markets, so the markets don't get killed, so people don't say, we're just going to keep buying gold, and gold will essentially overplace the markets, and the markets die. And that's what ends up occurring. Now, why do we say that that ends up going down to like the idea of wampum? Well, when we look at it, is wampum was not exactly something that once the mass production machine was created, wampum was something that could essentially be basically it was initially a currency, but once you could mass create it and essentially break the idea of limiting the number they could come on the market, it now is something that was no longer a hedge against inflation on the actual market like what it would have been back then, because now you could essentially flood the market with these things, and this meant that it was completely worthless. Thus, what we're talking about with back to the idea of Bitcoin, once the market gets flooded, it's no different than any other regular cryptocurrency that's not a hedge against inflation, like Dogecoin, which is meant as a novelty purpose only. And Dogecoin, if you look at the value, it's something like 2 cents per. And it's basically, initially it started at like $15 per, and it dropped down. It's something down to like 2 cents per, because they just keep flooding the number of Dogecoin to make sure that everybody has access to it. And this is basically what we're talking about here, and that's what's going to happen. And it's eventually going to happen with this, even if they want to restrict the amount of mining, because of what's going to happen. And they, even with the illegal mining with it, they could essentially adjust their numbers, but it's not going to do a bit of good, because they're not going to know the number of what illegal mining is happening on the whole market, because they're not going to have an actual number of the actual scale of what's occurring. And since this will happen globally, and it's basically, you'll be seeing that it'll be happening globally, and it's not something that they could essentially occur. It could occur at any location. I mean, we have over 190 countries around the globe, and when we look at that, there's plenty of areas for people to actually do this. Plus, when we look at the amount of areas that people would have, even within those 190 countries, okay, maybe not all of them have access to the internet, but we can assume that well over 100 countries are going to have access to the internet. And that makes it very, very difficult to track these people down. Then you have to go within the countries and track them down to find out where they're going. And they're not going to stay put in one specific location. They're not just going to stay in one location at a factory or something and wait to be arrested. And this is the whole issue that needs to be understood. And these things happen constantly with these different things, and these operations continue to happen, and they can keep arresting all they want, but it's not going to stop anything. And they could be a small operation, but small operations add up. Now, when we look at this was essentially just one invention. One invention basically essentially killed the whole wampum market. And that's essentially what illegal mining is going to do. It's going to kill the whole market. And it's going to take this from where it was as a high of over $10,000. I think it got up to $15,000 per. And it's down to $4,000. And it's probably going to crash it down to under $1 per because of this. And for those who were into Bitcoin. And when we look at it, it's not going to rise that high. Now, what needs to be understood is when you start investing in these, as I said, these things of copper, palladium, platinum, silver, and gold, you're going to realize that since that's been done for God knows how many years. I mean, this has been basically the history of mankind, and that's what ends up happening. That's what if you go with that, you're going to realize that that's been the holder of wealth since the history of man. You're going to realize that that's the real source of what to do. And that's the only way you're going to find a holder of wealth, because it's actually something physically that can't be copied. And the real problem is what can be copied, what can be mass produced. Now, when something can't be copied, something can't be mass produced, it makes it a great holder of wealth, and especially if it's actually usable for other products, that makes it even better. And that makes it actually very, very valuable. And that's where those 5 that we're talking about are great, and where other things such as cryptocurrencies and other things that have been used throughout time are poor, such as fiat currencies, which is this useless paper, no different than computer paper. Which the idea of cryptocurrencies, which is basically no different than digital code, which is no different than basically a line of code for a video game. The idea of wampum, which is basically no different than any other bead you get at something like a place like Michael's or Stein's or any of these other places like this, or any of the other Joanne Fabric or any of the other places that might sell like beads or any of these other decorative items in their actual store, and or whatever type of place with it. When you get something that's actually useless on the actual market itself, but actually only has a decorative purpose, it's going to be completely useless when it comes to currency. And eventually it gets to that point. Okay, it's pretty and all, but it doesn't have much of a purpose. This is why you need to understand you need something that's going to have an actual ability to be used as a medium that people are always going to have an actual thought of value with, and that's the point. Now, that's why I come to the point of getting back to the things that have lasted for over 2,000 years. And I think we can kind of agree with that point, because if it's lasted that long, it's not going to stop. People are not just going to say, with it, these things don't hold value anymore. That's not the case. They've always held value, and when countries stop relying upon them, it's when they go bust. I mean, when you look at the Roman Empire, when they started to slide down to lower forms of currency and then eventually went to fiat currency, that's when the Roman Empire fell. I mean, this is what causes it. And it's the actual cause of everything. So when we look at the solution to keeping a country going, it's basically sound monetary policy. And sound monetary policy is based on an actual physical thing that basically holds wealth and can't be copied. And it has universal wealth acceptance. And that's the whole point. And is never going to lose universal wealth acceptance. And this is why you want to look toward gold, silver, platinum, palladium, and copper. And those should be the 5 that you rely upon. And if you want to make basically rounds for your actual coins, for your actual currency, those should be the 5 you rely upon. That's it. No paper money. Paper money is just paper. Now, if you like this podcast, like, subscribe. Make sure you click the notification bell. Make sure you check out my Patreon page and become a patron. If you can't, don't have the money for it, make sure you send it out to someone else. And that's about it. And I will hopefully see you later on tonight if this didn't take too long to upload to my YouTube page. That's about it. Bye, everyone.